Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. There we go. Quick show of hands. Who here is familiar with the concept of AI, artificial intelligence? Excellent. Okay. For the one or two in the room that may not be familiar, it's in fact a little bit of a boring concept. It's not what you think about. It's not robots. It's not necessarily sentient beings that are coming down to take your jobs. What it is effectively pattern recognition. So machine learning, artificial intelligence covers a wide breadth of potential technologies. But effectively what it is it's all about recognizing patterns in data you've seen and applying it to data that you haven't seen. That's what is effectively machine learning and artificial intelligence. And it's a data-driven process. And what I mean by that is it requires data to function. Generally speaking, especially in neural networks, which you may or may not be familiar with, the more data you have, the more effective you can be at training these networks. So, oh no. I'm not. See? Okay. While that's coming back up. The question in the research side, in the biological and research space is, why hasn't there been an AI revolution? I mentioned that this is a data-dependent process. I'm not going to touch anything. I mentioned that this is a data-dependent process. We're constantly generating more data on the biospace. So why is it that AI hasn't really affected your clinical experience that much? We sequenced the first human genome in the year 2000. I remember I was an undergrad, they announced it, everybody high-fived. We all thought that this was going to be a revolution. We thought that this was going to change the way that we understood disease. We thought everything was going to be unlocked. We thought everything was going to be changed. And to some extent, it did certainly change research. Research before and after the human genome sequencing looked entirely different. But how much did it really affect what's in the clinic? How much can you really learn in terms of actionable insight from your own genome? There's a lot of services where you can kind of get your genome sequenced, and you can understand a little bit about your disease susceptibility, but how much of that is actionable? Really, what we've learned looking back over the past 17 years since we've sequenced the genome really has not lived up to our expectations. And why is that? There's this habit in biology that if you don't understand something, you generate more data. So we know a lot about where the genes are expressed, which tissues they're expressed in, when they turn on and off, how they interact with one another. But really, it's not having that impact in the clinic that we hope for. I'm going to cross my fingers. That's backwards. Excellent. At the same time, there's this issue in healthcare. We're spending billions of dollars, more so in the US than in Canada. But in the US, there's a $585 billion annual spend on healthcare. And there's inefficiencies. The American healthcare system is inefficient. I think we probably all have a few concepts of why that might be. But why isn't there more of an inroad for AI to address these inefficiencies? We've got tons of data on the biospace, and we've got inefficiencies in the healthcare space. So why aren't we using the data through AI to address these inefficiencies? And the answer is on the screen. So about 80% of the world's data in the healthcare space is unstructured. But that means that it doesn't fit into conventional databases. It's not easily applicable by the tools we have in the AI space. Now, talk about my first experience transitioning from an academic role to a startup role. I joined a startup company in 2015. It was a company that was built around a technology. That technology was a machine learning engine. Basically, it was a very good thing for taking data and building models that could then make various predictions. And they sat me down and they said, we want you to take this and let it loose on some problem in biology and come up with some huge solution, something groundbreaking in terms of a diagnosis. Our first project was working on autism. So we had 1,000 MRIs and fMRIs from patients that were diagnosed as being autistic over controls. And so we spent about a year taking that data, processing it, normalizing it, doing what you do with MRI, so subtracting the skull out of the MRI, out of the image, identifying what's gray matter, what's white matter, what's CSF, basically taking images and getting them to a format where we could actually do the machine learning, where we could apply our fancy machine learning tool. And that process took so long, we started to appreciate that there's value in what we were building kind of upstream of the machine learning. What was interesting was what you're looking at here are brain connectivity maps. So these are control patients on the left and autistic patients on the right. And each of these dots is a different part of the brain. And the lines between them is how often they fire at the same time. And so effectively, we had a fun story. We had there was some clear difference between autistic patients and control patients, where it looked like control patients had a much more coordinated firing of different parts of their brain. The problem was we couldn't replicate it. So we took this result and we tried to apply it to data that had been generated using different MRI machines, and we couldn't do it. What we found was that the biggest association we saw between patients was not whether they were disease or control, and it wasn't their age or their gender, it was which device did we use to generate their MRI. And an MRI is a device. It's an image-taking device. It really shouldn't be that different machine to machine, but still this is what we were seeing in terms of variability. And so we have identified 3 things that we feel are the major hurdles in terms of delivering on the promise of AI within the clinic. And the first is one that's a bit obvious. It's what I've just been discussing, which is heterogeneity. So data types are different. There's lots of different data types in biology. There's lots of different ways to process that data. What people don't really appreciate in the biological space is that every aspect of data collection, from the time a patient enters the clinic and their blood is drawn or their image is taken or their ECG is taken, every decision that's made in terms of processing and handling that data is part of your analytic pipeline. And if you don't control that, and if you don't appreciate that, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out. You're never going to get a meaningful model out of the data that you have. And this factors into the second reason as well, which is the lack of standards. There's not a lot of standards introduced in the clinical settings in terms of how data can be standardized across devices, but also in terms of how do we take raw data, let's say from an ECG or from some imaging device, and process it so that we can extract those numbers that we can use in our prediction frameworks. There's really, if you go through the literature, for every data type, there's going to be dozens of different ways that you can process that data, and any of those will yield you tremendously different results. And also the lack of scalability. So data is being generated at a tremendous rate. There's a lot of legacy issues in the hospital framework. How do we take data that's constantly being generated and do something meaningful with it? How do we get technology that scales with the pace of introduction of new data? So when I think about what's really limiting the application of AI in the clinical settings, it's not technological, because we have amazing technologies in AI. We have algorithms that are fantastic. It's more practical. It's how do we actually get this wealth of data that we're sitting on and process it in a meaningful way so that we can begin to make models that actually have robustness and applicability outside of just the machines that we've generated them on. And I feel that AI will continue to develop and grow and permeate all aspects of your life. But unless there's a revolution in the data collection side, and unless there's more of appreciation that you can't just take a machine learning algorithm and let it loose on biological data, as we learned the hard way, that revolution is going to be slow coming. I'm going to end with one of my favorite quotes about AI. I don't know who said it. I heard it at a conference a couple years ago, so if you know, you can tell me. I'd appreciate it. It's, don't worry about smart robots taking over, worry about the fact that dumb robots already have. And there's really no dumb robots. I mean, there's no dumb algorithms, really. But what makes them dumb is the data that we feed into them. It's that old adage again of garbage in, garbage out. And so unless that's appreciated, we are going to wind up with a series of dumb robots that are attempting to replace our doctors. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Should I stay here?
Sure.
Hi, yeah, so how do you face the challenge of companies not wanting to give you their data? Because health data is very private, right? Like, I don't want to give you my information, so how do you get the right data sets that way you can actually get your AI to learn properly?
That's a great question. So I'm going to talk from my personal experience. So in our company, what we've done is we operate more in the pharmaceutical space and kind of less in the health space, really because of availability of data. There's always an uphill battle in terms of trying to obtain enough data to make a meaningful model. The best way to do it really from a tech standpoint is to be involved in clinical trials where the data is more kind of available for research purposes, or to work with anonymized data. The problem with public data sets is that they've already been processed and processed and processed before you get them. And so you run into the same issue of anything I generate, I don't know how extendable it is to other circumstances. So really it's kind of a catch-22. You kind of have to demonstrate value before you can apply your technology, and you can't validate your technology unless you have the data. And so you really do have to kind of have a bit of an in terms of let's say, a large clinical trial cohort that you can try to get some early stage influence with.
Hey, just really quick, I guess. When you went through and did your autism study, how did you deal with the fact that I guess the output of some sort of prediction could impact diagnostic or like the treatment pathway of somebody? And how did you deal with the fact that you're never going to be 100% accurate?
You mean ethically?
Yeah, well, I guess ethically from a legal standpoint of when do I start believing machine, what percent accuracy,
Yeah.
and the transparency of dealing with, you have something like a neural network where the weights aren't necessarily transparent about what the decision is being made for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. We wrestle with this all the time. And so, I mean, at what point do you feel confident enough in a model that you can deploy it into clinical settings and kind of deal with the fact that you know what the error is. You know that at some point it's going to misdiagnose somebody. You kind of have to, one, trust that you're going to be able to beat whatever the existing standard is. I mean, maybe that's just kind of a bit hand-wavy, but I mean, at least knowing that you're having a bit more accuracy than what the kind of, I mean, for autism, it's still a little bit subjective, and so that's something you can clearly demonstrate. You can take the human element out of it. Maybe you can perform a little bit better. Validation in terms of clinical trial validation is certainly key for any AI algorithm before application. But certainly you're always very aware of trying to make your models as good as possible. And so that's really the area that we're trying to work in, is trying to understand, you know, it's very easy to see what the error rate on a model is, but it's much harder to see how that error rate's going to translate to different patient groups. And that's not something you can understand until you kind of slowly roll it out. That's part of, I mean, what I talked about with adoption. Think about self-driving cars. We've had the AA technology for self-driving cars for 5 or 10 years. How long will it be till you can put your kids in the back seat and press, you know, go to grandma's? It's good, that adoption is going to take a long time, and the technology may be fantastic. But I mean, who do you blame when that car gets in an accident, or how do you deal with the, you know, the ethics of that? And so it's a great question, and it's one. Fortunately, I only have a long, rambling, incoherent answer for it, but it really just it comes down to a long process of incremental validation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gabe.